Okay, good evening, and welcome to the meeting for the Coeur d'Alene School District 271 for December 17th, 2018. Would the gentlemen please remove their hats, and would everyone please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, well, thank you for joining us tonight. Before we get going here, I'll just take a brief moment and introduce our participants up front here. I'll start at my far right with Miss Lynn Town, our clerk of the board. And to my immediate right is Dr. Stephen Cook, our superintendent. To my left is Mr. Tom Hearn, our vice chair. Miss Lisa May, school board trustee. Tamber Pickford, trustee. And Jen Brumley, trustee. My name is Casey Morstro, and I am the chair. Public comment on posted agenda items is scheduled near the start of the meeting. Please sign in on the sheet provided at the entrance door. Comments may also be submitted to the board in writing through the clerk. Okay. Is there a motion to approve tonight's agenda? Thank you. All in favor? Aye. Aye. Okay. And is there a motion to approve tonight's consent agenda, which was a travel request for the Lake City High School Honor Jazz and Choir?
So moved. Second.
Did you get that, Lynn? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. So we're going to have public comment up first here. Ms. Town's grabbing the list to see who signed in. Before we get to that, just want to remind the public, while this is a meeting of the Board of Trustees that takes place in public, it is not a meeting with the public. It's a meeting of the board to conduct district business. The board does allow limited public comment on district-related items. Tonight, we're only taking public comment in regards to the potential levy request. Those wishing to address the board during the public comment period are limited to one comment not to exceed 3 minutes. If you have additional comments, you may submit those in writing through our clerk of the board, Ms. Lynn Town. Please keep in mind that board members will not respond to public comment. Okay. First up, Russ McLean. Good evening, Russ. And you know the drill, but for those of you who don't, just make sure the red light's on at the mic over at the podium, please.
There it is. Well, you know, I thought this was going to be more of a forum, but first off, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Cook, for trying to deal with the growth. And that you stood up, and I haven't seen that in any superintendent yet. They usually have to try to figure out ways to hustle funding. So that being said, I appreciate you for it. This levy coming up, I know all the needs and all that. I am in favor of the permanent, but there has to be some concessions. One, you get a contract for 10 years, you don't break. And I would like to see, I mean that sincerely, I'd like to see a concession like giving the Hayden School back to the city of Hayden, because that's a large money amount, and you should be able to bankroll enough money to do your purchasing, do your building in another place, and give Hayden some. We've all been paying tax on that for 100 years, you know. So I think that to put the wording, I listened to the attorney lady here on the television, and Danielle, is that correct? Yeah. And the language has to be at a Trump 4th grade level, so it cannot be twisted by people who have hijacked the Republican Party. Is that polite? I'm not, walking lightly is not my strong suit. But that's really all I got to say. I would like to see that school go back to Hayden so it could be used, Boys and Girls Club. All the kids can use it. And senior, you know, the seniors could help the kids with their reading, you know, things like that. It could be a good program there. And that's about it. But I'd like to see the language drawn in a way that it cannot be twisted into something that it's not, and that's exactly what they will do. And a few concessions. I think the money's warranted, you know, and I'm sorry that we educate our kids for some other state because our legislatures choose not to be responsible enough to draw in business. That was another polite one too. That's pretty good. That's two. And that's about it. But if you make the language clear and untwistable, then I think you guys have a pretty good shot of it. So that's all I got to say. And thanks again. That was really stand up of you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McCain. Next up is John Barlow.
Good evening, Board and Dr. Cook. I'm John Barlow. I have a residence in Coeur d'Alene. And as some of you know, I've always been involved in schools since I came here 40 years ago. And I have to tell you right up front, I believe the levy is appropriate at the amount that you deem appropriate. I don't know if it's 20 or 22 or what the numbers are, but I think it's appropriate to do that at this time under the current laws and guidelines. My purpose of being here is my concern of the consideration of a permanent, perpetual levy. If you go back to 2006, when the legislature, by Constitution, the state was required to fund our schools for maintenance and operations. And because of economic times that were at the threshold at that point in time, the situation changed to where M&O levies were happening and have happened every 2 years since. Essentially, if you think of that, funding for our education in a large proportion is transferred from the state to property tax. And our voters are pretty bright people, and they understand property tax issues. You, as a board, and your prior members have earned respect that has garnered great support, mostly evidenced by your bond of 78%. But I believe to assume that these voters will allow or feel comfortable with a perpetual property tax, I believe is a big mistake. And I don't want to see that happen because there's momentum for so many great things. I know the growth is troubling. I know from being involved in trying to help with the Prairie School that you really need more schools soon. You're going to have to ask a bond. You're going to have to go back to these same voters for a 2/3 majority to do that. And I believe that to ask for and think that, and the recent demographic of the last election shows that most of our voters are in my age group that have good memories. And so be very careful. It's more of a caution, and be very careful about that decision, that it doesn't hurt these other efforts, because if the solution is, well, we can always vote out a board member or board, that takes time. And in the meantime, voters are going to be stuck with this levy that might be perpetual. And I just felt it was important to give you the feel, and I've talked to a number of people, and it's almost unanimous in our old age that this is not a good thing to put upon property tax voters when M&O should be funded by the state. That's where we all should be working, is to go back to them and have them do what they're constitutionally required to do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next up, John Rubert.
How do you do? I am absolutely against the levy and the perpetual, absolutely. One of my first problems is, is I've known the last two superintendents, and I broached some points to Hazel. She listened. She was great. She didn't understand what an HSA was. Within a year or so, she came back and was all about it. Then she got shot down. I went to the union negotiations a few years ago. I was treated rotten, rudely by the union representatives. I was also told that the reason why the elections are in the spring, because they were purposely put there because they couldn't pass them in the fall, which means that we're teaching our kids to cheat. And yes, I absolutely feel it's cheating to put it in the spring, because if you count up the number of people of votes, I'm sure if you count the people that work for the school district, other union people, relatives, that's where most all the yes votes are. I challenge you to put it in the fall, especially if you're going to do a permanent levy, which I think is totally wrong. The problem I have is I don't have 11% put away for me every year. I've had a business. I've worked hard. All I have is Social Security. You are double taxing me by taking out of my home, because for retired people, one of the best things they can do is have a rental. I bought a place on the lake. I live in a small cabin. I rent the house, okay? I pay over $1,000 a year because you the way it's set up, disproportionately you nail people with any property income. So I basically pay a second time. I appreciate Lisa suggesting that you address retired people, because where are we supposed to get our income for the rest of our lives? We don't have somebody that's done a great job like he's done for Percy or she. We have to do it on our own. So our best savings is our homes. So we put our money in our homes, and then you take $1,000 a year out of them, okay? It's just not right. Another thing, I called and I spoke because you quit sending the bus out to me, okay? First thing the gal told me was, well, we had to do it to save money. Then when I called her back a few weeks later, she said, well, that's not the reason we did it, but that's what she said. Called and left a message. I've talked to the past two superintendents, knew them. Dr. Cook didn't return my call. Maybe it was an accident, but I just don't understand. Literally, I lost over $5,000 worth of rental because last year I could not rent because I just happened to have families. Because you don't take the bus out there. And on top of that, the highway district quit plowing the road so they couldn't even drive. I've dealt with that. That's where I was last month, talking to them. They are going to plow to Mawkins Bay now, so at least we can drive on the road. So you're levying me $1,000 a year, and you don't even send the bus out there. I have a problem with that. It seems like everything is, teachers need to be paid extremely well, but there's absolutely no reason why they can't teach 5 hours a day out of the 7.5 hours they work. That would mean 6 periods a day. I know it's not easy. I teach ski lessons and snowboard lessons. My wife is a teacher, but she can't even work here because what you guys pay substitute teachers is less than what you're paying a lot of your support staff. The support staff is 51% in this school district. Why? No business could operate that way. Coeur d'Alene Charter Academy has a 23% support budget. Why aren't you hiring the retired principal to come and tell you how to do it? I've offered suggestions. I showed where you could save $8 million. Nobody wanted to hear it. In fact, they were very upset that I even suggested it, because I've had to balance a business for many years. Anyway, I think you need to go back. I think you need to move the vote to the fall so everybody gets a chance to vote. Granted, they should be voting in the spring, but they vote in the fall. I'm asking that you move the vote to the fall, and that you go back and that you look at some of the suggestions people have made. And I know you don't have to have, granted, right now is the perfect time to cut your support staff because there's lots of jobs. My opinion is you have way too much support staff. I could never run my business with that kind of support staff percentage. Sorry I'm passionate, but I hope you guys will listen, and I'm happy to sit down and help whoever's doing the budget. They didn't want to hear me a few years ago, and But I appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you. Okay, next up is Wanda Quinn.
Good evening. Wanda Quinn. I reside at 210 Lakeview Drive, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And I am here today to speak in support of the levy amount, and but to express my concerns in regards to a indefinite term or permanent levy, whichever you choose to weigh it. And my concerns rest in the fact that according to the Constitution, it's up to the legislature of Idaho to maintain a general, uniform, and thorough system of public education. And I think those permanent funds should be coming from the state, and it shouldn't be garnered from patrons of 271. And that's where our effort should be for that permanent funding. I also don't think it's necessarily positive reinforcement or a thank you to our patrons of the district who have supported us through the years, and I believe very generously, to take that support and turn it into a permanent levy. My years on the board, I viewed this, anytime we were coming up with a levy, is an opportunity to, it was sort of an accountability with our patrons. It was a time where we could say, here's how we are, here's what we're doing, here's what we'd like to do, and to maintain or to improve. And it was also an opportunity for us to set those levy amounts in consideration with where the community was at that time financially. And so it was always in consideration with variable factors at the time we were setting that. I feel there's variables right now that are sort of beyond your control. You'll be, we'll yet to see whether there'll be a new funding formula, what that translates to for the district, the consideration of the grocery tax and its removal, where would that be? And then just a question, I know you can't answer it, but maybe in your discussions you might. My reading of 33-802 paragraph 5, in relationship to this indefinite term, the question is, if voted in, how would it be eliminated? And is the only way to eliminate it a vote of the board? It's not, there's not an opportunity for the patrons to take that action. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and that's all we had signed up for tonight to talk. Dr. Cook, I'll turn it over to you with the information you have to present, and then we'll discuss from there.
Thank you, Chair Morris Rowe. I think we're going to start off with, if you recall, the last meeting we had some conversation about impact to taxing capacity for both the amount and potential for future asks, and how that might be in play at this particular price point at $20 million, and then even at an increased price point. And so we contacted Eric Herringer to kind of run some numbers to look at kind of hypotheticals, if you will. What would be if we were to ask for example, $22 million and I think a $90 million bond in, I think we did it in 22. Just as a, now realize this number is not a vetted number that's gone through the system. This was mostly about just hypotheticals, what it would look like over overall taxing capacity over time. And so Eric's graciously agreed to come back up and look at what those impacts might be. And we're going to include from his presentation also some information on how that impacts, for example, the total tax bill of median house prices, and I want to make sure we get an opportunity to show that at whatever number we're talking about, what the overall impact would be in the community. So a starting point with this, and we've also got Daniel Quaid here to answer questions with regards to ballot language and other things as we get along in that conversation. But for right now, I'd like to turn this over to Eric and have him present some of that data that he's collected for us.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. Good evening. Is this on? Red light somewhere? We're good? Okay, thank you. So Eric Herringer with Piper Jaffray. We've presented information on the bond and levy discussion a few times now. I don't know how, is there a clicker? Oh, here's the clicker. Okay. So I've added a few data points to consider before we get into the summary of the new analysis that we did, but just kind of looking at some of the reference points or the context for this discussion around your property tax levy rate and the notion of affordability when we're operating under this plan to try to keep that tax rate stable and have it allow to that stable tax rate to grow revenue to keep up with the growth of the district. But I wanted to take kind of more of maybe a longer look back and then some additional data that Dr. Cook had suggested we look at, and I think it's good data for you to have. So this slide here is you've seen it before, but we started it in 2007, and if you look from 2007 forward, it tells one story, but if you go back prior to 2007, you see some historical data about the tax rates of the district that probably are helpful to see how much higher the tax rate per thousand was for the school district. And some of that, obviously, was those purple bars, which was the regular maintenance and operation levy that was part of the school funding formula, where the school funding formula basically drove this many dollars per support unit, but said if you get this much local, because you're going to levy $3 per thousand effectively locally, the state will send the balance. The state did away with that regular property tax levy to support M&O, and then put it all on the sales tax. So that purple went away. That was a legislative action. The green that went away was your plant levy, and historically the district was building buildings with a plant levy. And it did it on a 4-year cycle. You did a 4-year plant levy, built some buildings, then renewed the 4-year. And that went away in 2006 and wasn't renewed. And your tax rate obviously dropped significantly in 7 to $1.12. And then 11 and 12, the K-Tech levy is what those larger purple pieces are to help build K-Tech together with Lakeland and Post Falls. And then you can see in 13, that went away. But the red, which is the bond, that was that 2012 bond that came on the tax rolls in 13, and then the bond in 16. So again, you've seen this data, you've looked at it, you know you're at 223 this year, but I think having that historical perspective, going back a little further, is perhaps helpful. I believe you've seen this slide before. This is fiscal 2019, or the current tax year, where the district, its tax rate sits relative to the districts, the surrounding districts. And you can see you're kind of right in the middle, right above Post Falls, quite a bit below Boundary, but generally in the middle. And one of the things we were talking about here is, okay, well, is it too low? One of the benefits of having a large tax base like you do is that you can generate a fair amount of dollars with a low tax rate. Districts without a lot of market value would have a higher tax rate. So we started looking at, well, let's look at another measure, which is what's the levy dollar per student. And in this case, we're looking at data, and I apologize, some of this data is fiscal 19, some of it's 18. In this case, we're using 18 data because we don't have the fiscal 19 enrollment data. So we're basically going, we have fiscal 18 enrollment, we have fiscal 18 levy dollars. So we're taking the total levy dollar, I'm sorry, I went backwards. We're taking the total levy dollar and dividing it by the enrollment, or the number of kids. And again, Coeur d'Alene is there right around what the statewide average is of $1,901 per student. Your total levy is $2,025. And in this case, I went beyond just sort of some of the neighboring districts that are of size, like Post Falls or Kellogg, but also pulled in what are the urban districts around the state that would be comparable in terms of enrollment size, tax base, urban center, economic commerce center type places like Pocatello or Idaho Falls, Nampa, Twin Falls, Lewiston, Boise. And you can see, again, sort of right in the middle, right around that statewide average, bringing in levy dollars per kid that would appear to make sense given the data. And then this, and this was Dr. Cook's suggestion, is to go out and get median home, some measure of home value for these communities, these same communities that we're looking at here, the Pocatellos, the Idaho Falls, the Twin Falls, the Nampas, the Boise's, Lewistons, and saying, what's the median home? So what we went and picked out through Zillow, through their data, which is relatively current, is the median home value. You know, and median is the midpoint, right? So it's like if you line up all the home values from lowest to highest, it's the one smack dab in the middle. It's not a numeric average, it's a median. It's typically what economists like to use to sort of figure out what the representative value of a community is. And so we gathered up that data, and we said that the median home value, for example, in Coeur d'Alene is listed at $297,500. If you back out the homeowner's exemption, that's $197,500. You multiply it by the property tax rate, and that's your tax bill on the median home value for Coeur d'Alene is $440. Compare that to Twin Falls, which has a lower value, $191,400 median home value. After the homeowner's exemption, which is 50% of the home value up to a maximum of $100,000, their taxable value is $95,700, a tax rate of $4.59, so double what you see here, but on a lower value, and it's only $1 difference. So on the median home value in Twin, it's $439, median home value in Coeur d'Alene, $440, median home value in Nampa, $457. So I thought, this is some pretty interesting data to see. Again, there's a pretty tight grouping: Idaho Falls, Twin Falls, Coeur d'Alene, Nampa. McCall we put in because, again, a high value district, lots of market value with not as many kids, so they have a low tax rate. But their tax burden for the median home value is higher. Boise's certainly a lot higher. But you can see the data, and I thought it was, again, another data point to suggest that the property taxes, by comparison, aren't out of line by this measure either. Now, if you have a $2 million home, you're paying a lot more to, the school district than the median home value. So,
excuse me, Mr. Henninger, is that Boise rate also includes their permanent levy?
Correct. Yeah, this is the total tax rate for the school district. Bonds, whatever, permanent supplemental bonds,
okay,
you name it, it's in that total.
Because they have, as you know, have some special taxing authority
Certainly
that we don't have.
And McCall does too. McCall also has a permanent supplemental that's not a voted permanent supplemental, but it's something that happened after the property tax relief in 2006. They kept, so did Blaine County. There's a handful of districts that have that, something that's like Boise's charter, but it's in there.
Okay, thank you.
Any questions on the data? Information there. So now getting into the analysis. We've got 3 scenarios that we're looking at. And scenario 1, which you've seen before, which I wrote a memo for the district about a month ago, $20 million supplemental levy as a permanent levy. Now, that could also be a $20 million supplemental levy that's voted on every 2 years, right? It's not going to change my analysis in terms of the tax impact, whether it's assumed to vote every 2 years or permanent, but $20 million per year going forward. And then a $34 million bond election in 2020. So you've seen that before. We also ran the same $20 million supplemental levy with a $40 million bond in 2020, and then a final scenario where we looked at 22 million permanent supplemental, or 22 million every 2 years, and then with a $90 million bond election in 2022. So the way we, if you recall from the information I provided before, the way we looked at this is we said, okay, let's structure the levies and the bond repayment to try to stay at the tax rate of $2.23 of the district and not have that tax rate go up with the addition of these two funding pieces. And we, with modeling your growth going forward at 6.07%, which is your 20-year historical compound growth rate. So that's a historical 20-year, compound growth rate that if we model that in with that kind of growth, this graph, what it represents is the excess capacity that's generated. And what this is saying, what this chart is summarizing, is that you could do 20 million and a $34 million bond, not increase the tax rate, stay at $2.23, assuming you stayed at 223 and got 6.07% growth. Those blue bars represent the additional levy dollars you could generate going forward. So importantly, there's not a lot of capacity in 2020, 2021. And then as the market value grows, you start to see some capacity, whether that's an increase in the supplemental, if it's not permanent, and or if it is permanent and you add on to it, or if it's not permanent and you increase it on those 2-year cycles. It could be a plant levy. It could be money that could be used to support another bond. How much of a bond, I'd have to run the numbers to say what you could do in 2024 with that kind of a revenue stream.
Can I ask you a quick question on this? So it's market value growth is what we're talking about, just to make
Correct.
sure everybody's clear. So market value growth at assuming 6.07%, and that's been our average over 20 years. What does this look like if we slow down, the economy slows down, and we're looking at 0% growth? How long until we start seeing our straight line and our value,
Right. You start seeing a lot less capacity.
Right, but is it a quick, is it 1 or 2 years of, a flat market growth is flat or slightly decreasing that our capacity is going to shrink, or do you feel confident that we've got a window here? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. I have a summary slide that I think was going to answer that question.
Okay.
And
I saw the other slides, so we can get.
Yeah, so I think on the last one, you'll sort of see what I've calculated as what does it take to get that, what kind of growth does it take to get that? If we don't get 6.07, what do you have to get to not have to have the tax rate go up? So, and then I'll have that for the other scenarios. Scenario 2, 20 million on the supplemental, $40 million bond. So really the only difference here is we're adding $6 million to the bond price tag, and that's not going to add $6 million to the annual levy because we're going to pay back the $6 million over 20 years with interest. So it doesn't take that much more over that 20-year period to support the $6 million based on the size of your tax base. So again, it's the same summary type information. You can do that and keep the tax rate at 223, no increase, 6.07% growth. It's just that the excess capacity is lower. I don't know if you can tell just by toggling back and forth here, but this is $34 million bond. This is a $40 million bond. So you got to wait till 2023 until you have a little bit of capacity, to whereas new capacity came back in 2022 with scenario 1. And all of those bars are a little bit lower on this scenario. That makes sense, right?
Eric, these scenarios are ran with 20-year bonds, is that
correct? 20-year payback.
And our current bonds are kind of 12, 13-year bonds, somewhere in that ballpark? Does that sound right? 13.
I have not committed that one to memory, but I have the data. Yeah, the 2017 bond goes out to 2031. So 14, 15 years. I would say that standard school bond in Idaho is typically 20 years, and this excess levy capacity would allow you to shorten that up and do it something. Intuitively, I can look at that and say you could do it in 15 years. So here's the bigger one, 22 million supplemental levy and a $90 million bond. The difference on the bond is it's 2022, not 2020. And it was tight, but we could get something structured in that could stay at $2.23 at 6.07% growth. But you can see from the graph that, in 2020, there's a blue line is below zero. That would have to be supported by some bond reserve funds to stay to keep the tax rate at 223, and then really not generate a whole lot of excess capacity until 2026. And then you see you start to recapture it as the growth goes. But that's a long time. You'd have to wait till 2026, 2027 to have additional capacity and 6.07% growth for the next 5-6 years to get there.
But we could also do an SPFL. It would be a smaller amount of money, but there would be other options. It's not displayed in this model, but there are other.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you could do a $50 million bond and a couple $1 million plant levy. Yeah, lots of combinations. So this last slide is to say 6.0. So if 6.07% annual, counting on 6.07% annual growth is a little risky. You've certainly had that kind of growth over the last 5 or 6 years, but there's also years where it's been negative during the downturn. But you could also envision a time when things just kind of mellow out, flatten out, and you see 2 to 3% growth for a couple years. So we said, what would be the minimum growth you'd need to experience in market value to support these proposals and not have to have a tax rate increase? So scenario 1 is 2% annual growth for 10 years. So we ran some different kind of, 2%, how long would that? 3%, you need 3% per year for 5 years or 5% for 3 years. So those seem like realistic scenarios to me. I think that you would be in a good position to stand behind scenario 1 and think you're not going to have to increase the tax rate. Scenario 2, you need a little bit more growth, so 3% annual for 6 years or 5% annual for 4 years, so 1 more year at 5% or 1 more year at 3% to get to that scenario 2 with a $40 million bond. With scenario 3, you basically need 6% for 6 years, and then it could go to 0, right? But if it goes to 0, then you're looking at, okay, well, if you need to do anything else, then you're talking about an increase then, but that's 6 years from now. So that's what that slide is telling you. That if you think that the next 6 years are going to look like the last 6 years in terms of your market value and growth and construction and value changes, then scenario 3 is doable. So speaking of growth and market value, here's the historical. And the data's there, and again, I point out the last 5 years have been very strong, but from 2009 to 2013, and again, worst recession since the Great Depression, I wouldn't expect us to experience that kind of crash in market values at that extent or that level, but it's certainly something where market values could go flat. They could turn slightly negative. I don't think that's our short-term outlook, certainly not, but in the next 6 years, it's a long time. So I think it's important to be a little bit cautious about counting on that 6.07% growth for a longer period of time. And that's the last slide. So. You are welcome. My opinion that you are in a very good position from a planning standpoint has not changed. It's just, you know, there's flexibility to do some of the things you want to do without having to increase the tax rate, which is a position that I think, you know, the district's worked hard to be in at this point. And I might, I would, if I may, I might address the one question or one point that was brought up about the timing of the election. A supplemental election in November would not allow you to get this on the tax rolls. So part of the reason districts run their supplemental levies in March and May is so that they can build a budget for the next year and know that they have those funds as part of their budget, and then be able to certify the taxes in September, which is the one time a year that you are allowed to, or that's the only time of year you can certify your property taxes to the county. So that is one of the reasons, I think it's the primary reason that the legislature's given schools March as an election day when no other district, no other public entities have March as an election day but school districts, and it's for that reason.
Thank you, Eric. The next thing I think that we wanted to show you guys, and I hope the guys in the booth are on this, we'll see how good we do on the fly. Look at this, they're already anticipating, was to recall, if you will, the impact when we ran our original numbers based upon the data that Eric provided for us. We started talking about the fact that due to increased assessment rates, that if we were to maintain the levy rate, or the levy amount, excuse me, at $16 million, that actually our taxpayers would see a decrease in the rate to do that. And we ran those numbers, if you recall. Here they are. Thank you, guys. They're rock stars back behind that. That's actually a room back there. Did you know there's people in there? Anticipating our every move. And we want to show this. I think it's really important to note here when you incorporate, this is at the $20 million increase rate. The first, actually it's both. If the far right column is the value or the decrease in the taxes annually, if we stay at 16 million for a house at, like, take halfway down at $400,000, you get your $100,000 exemption, so taxable value is $300,000. If you go all the way to the far right column, that's the decrease in taxes that people would see at that, if they're homeowners at that valued house, if we maintain the $16 million as an annual levy request. What we show in the third column is for, let's use the same example, $400,000 home with a $300,000 tax value minus the homeowner's exemption would give you a 52-cent annual decrease, 52 cents annually decrease if we run it at 20 million. So when we set this up, if you recall that we were talking about this idea of trying to base the model, and I'm going down that rabbit hole again, and I apologize because I'm trying to get this cleaner and tighter. But basically we base this on how could we do the least damage to our homeowners, and in essence model this only on new construction, so that we're in essence, when new construction brings in new people with new kids, that we would be expected to accommodate. And so lo and behold, as we do all this modeling, this $4 million increase is kind of the sweet spot of here's how we'd spend the money if we had $4 million additionally. And that's where you saw the ask for those 5 things: mental health requests, safety and security, additional staffing, increased building budgets to a slight amount, and I'm forgetting, teacher and staff professional development, and 2.5 million of that 4 million committed to some form of staff compensation. And that's the model we ran into, which is in essence a flat impact to taxpayers. And so now this is a model, we get it. If somebody has a significant upgrade in their assessed values or those kind, there will be exceptions. We get that, and we are first to acknowledge that that is the case. But ultimately, the idea was that the model would propose essentially a net neutral impact on local taxpayers with regards to their home values. In essence, it's allowing a little bit of flexibility in the rate to drop slightly, to compensate for the amount that the assessed values are going up. If you notice in the right column, obviously the rate would be decreasing. I don't know if I'd say significantly, but it's going to decrease some to accommodate the fact that tax relief would be happening at that particular formula. So if you know the value of your house or the current assessed value of your house, you'd see if we did nothing and left it at 16 million, that's the tax relief on property tax bills due to the school district levies alone. Remember, there's more than just school district levies that people would be receiving from the district. So. We've got more, and I think Danielle's here also to answer questions about ballot language, but I think it might be best if we compartmentalize the conversation in segments, if you guys would like to do that. I think we've got a lot more data that could be pulled up if you have more questions, but at this point everything we've got now are from previous presentations, so we'd entertain any questions you guys might have. Thanks, booth guys.
If you don't mind, Dr. Cook, I think I'd like to hear, and I guess we'll see what the board thinks, but I was thinking we'd hear from Ms. Quaid on kind of the ballot language. I know there was some proposals there, and we have it in our packet, but maybe just a kind of summary of what happened there.
So let me introduce this. So if you recall, Daniel and I were trying to get the possibility of language to be presented both as a singular question for the permanency and the amount, and a split question for if we wanted to go to the taxpayers and say, all right, here's the amount we're suggesting, and here's the amount in this increased amount in perpetuity, as separate questions, and what would the language look like on that. And we've run a couple of examples by the Secretary of State's office, and I think Danielle has some things that she can share with you on what they've suggested this would potentially look like if we were going to do either or.
Thank you, Dr. Cook and members of the board. We did talk about ballot language quite a bit a couple of weeks ago, and I was tasked to go back and look at different options for making it bringing clarity to those two questions, where one question is just voting the increased amount for 2 years, and a second question is making that increased amount permanent. We drafted a couple of different proposals, and as Dr. Cook mentioned, we sent them to the Secretary of State's office, and unfortunately, as I expected, they were resistant to making the two questions interlinked. So they did not recommend going with that type of scenario where you approve one and then the second question approves the perpetuity, as we were discussing. We did continue to work a little bit on the language for the original proposed two-question approach to make it a little bit more clear. If you see in the option 2, question number 2 at the end, we did make it clear, or a little more clear, I believe, that the district would not take advantage of both of the second, or both of the, if to the extent, so we'd have to do two different questions. So we'd have to vote 20 million in perpetuity and then vote, or I'm trying to think what, we had them backwards last time, but the way that we have it set up this time is to have the first question be 20 million in perpetuity and the second question be $20 million for 2 years, but making it clear to the voters that in the event the question in perpetuity was approved, the 2-year question would not be used to authorize an additional $20 million. So that's where you see at the end of that question 2, the additional clarity saying the district will nonetheless not levy more than $20 million per year. So making it clear that you wouldn't take advantage of $40 million in levy in the event both questions passed.
So are you at all concerned that the voters may read that first part and just say no because they see that perpetuity and the permanent? This is our best option.
This is
the questions to be separated out and give the voter a choice on whether there's permanency.
This is the option that the Secretary of State's office was willing to sign off on. It was Dr. Cook's recommendation to keep the permanency first, so you still have the option to flip-flop the questions. I think that's a little, it just looks a little weak-kneed to go out with your first question being what you really don't want. Sorry, I'm getting too close again. And your second question being what you really do, and I think a little bit more confusing. I continue to be concerned about the two questions being confusing to people and causing a split in the vote. We've tried to alleviate some of that confusion, but we would definitely, the information campaign would definitely have to focus on, vote yes on both and make sure that people understood, how that would work.
Both these motions, okay. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Questions for Ms. Quaid on that? Okay. Any questions for Dr. Cook here before we get into discussion?
I do have a reminder.
Sure.
I do have one reminder that with regards to the permanency option, before you start your discussion, remember that it's predicated on this idea that we would have an agreement with some form of agreement with the URA, the local URA, to ensure that, Danielle, prepare to fix this if I say this incorrectly, but I'm going to do my best. A voted levy receives the benefit of both the tax increment and the URA increment. Is that a fair term? Is that the right term? Whereas a permanent levy, due to a slight glitch in the legal outline of it, does no longer subjects the URA to that, and that's about, I think in our area, that's about a 7% difference. We're meeting with them and discussing through those circumstances, and any recommendation, if the board so chooses or so inclined to investigate permanency, I would recommend that we have that addressed officially in some capacity before it would be my recommendation for that to take place. So just as a forewarning to the conversation. So,
What is your time frame on that getting resolved?
We're predicting, of course, that we can, but I would believe that we could. We're in conversation now, and it's been positive, and I do believe that we'll continue to be positive, and I think we would be able to give you some guidance on that within the next, I would say by mid-January.
I'm going to, if you don't mind, you know how I like to simplify it, like take
Sure.
it down a level from an attorney and a doctor. So I'm going to make sure I understand it. So
Not that kind of
currently,
doctor.
on a 2-year levy, if the levy amount's 20 million or 16 million, whatever the amount is, that's dispersed to all taxpayers, whether they're in a URD or not. Correct?
So in currently with a 2-year levy, you levy everyone within the district. The permanent levy takes the portion that's in the URA areas and gives them the revenue that's above the base or the tax increment.
So without that,
I can pull up a slide. Hey, Seth, can you pull up the slide of Eric's last presentation? I think it has this called out on about slide 5.
Right there.
so I guess the reason we need the agreement is so we're keeping it fair for all the taxpayers, or
So
equal, I guess, for all the
Essentially, what the URA would be agreeing to do is to rebate the funds to the district that they received. So the taxing would happen the same way because the county's not going to change what's in the code. So the district would have to make a calculation, which Eric has worked on, to levy a certain amount less. It'd be 20 million, less whatever amount needs to be levied. And maybe I need to have him explain this. You want to?
Yeah, Dr. Cook, I'm not sure if you meant on this
Yeah,
presentation.
no,
or
it's not on
previous
that one. I said the wrong
Yeah.
presentation.
Actually,
I'm sorry about that, Seth.
I can do this though. So, how do I turn that? To?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
Right there, the top. See, we've got it up there. We've got the net taxable value plus the urban renewal.
Yeah.
That was the one I was talking about.
Yeah. So your existing supplemental levy is levied against the net taxable value of the district, which is 9.9 billion, plus the 734.8 million of urban renewal value. So that's what 10.6 billion. So that's your tax base for so when they calculate out your tax rate, they say, 16 million, which is your current supplemental, divided by that 10.6 million, it produces a millage rate. So now, if it was 16 million, for example, and it was permanent, the county would take the 16 million divided by the 9.9 billion, and it would come up with a higher tax rate because it would take a higher millage rate to generate those dollars. But then that millage rate would get applied to the 734, and that revenue would go to the Urban Renewal Agency. So that's kind of what we're trying to deal with here is how do you make sure that there's no windfall? I mean, right now, the Urban Renewal Agency is not getting a portion of revenue from your supplemental levy. But if you made it permanent, they would. You'd still get your 16 million, but now they'd get, I'm calling it a windfall. Now, if you had an agreement to have it sent back to you, then you'd get a windfall, right? You'd get your 16 million plus whatever that additional was. And the districts that you've looked at, and we've looked at too, that have the permanent supplemental, like Moscow, that's how they handle it. And so, it generates the amount that was approved, and then money goes to the urban renewal. It's not too hard for me to figure out what you need. If you got 20 million approved, then for example, you would only certify 18.6 million. Because that would allow for a tax rate that would generate 18.6 million for you, 1.4 million for the Urban Renewal Agency, and if you had an agreement that they'd send it back, 18.6 that you got, 1.4 million that they send back, you got 20 million. It's just a ratio. We just look at the ratio of the districts. We take the total of those two, the 10.6 billion. What ratio of that? 7%, I think, is the number. 7% of your market values from the urban renewal. So you just haircut. You'd have to do that every year, though. You'd have to look at that each year and kind of engineer it to make the calculation work. Is that what you wanted?
Well, the question, I have two questions, and it might be, I don't know who it's for, but we talk about future boards and indebting them or to decisions. So let's say the Urban Renewal Board decided to go ahead and give the money back. Their board changes over in 5 years. They decide they no longer want that agreement, but we have a levy in perpetuity. Do we create some sort of addendum on our agreement that that's for all future boards, or how do we?
Well, the agreement would still be enforceable against them at that time, even if their board turned over.
Even if their board turned over. Okay, and the second question I had was a question that was asked earlier. How are permanent levies undone? So the community, let's say, votes for this March, but in 3 years decides they no longer support permanency. The state's fully funded education, things are different. How is that undone?
The board, majority vote of the board.
It's a simple majority of the board and then the levy.
Well, I'd just like to say a couple things. At the last board meeting, I read a statement. I'm not going to read it again. But I do want to make a couple points that I made last time. First of all, I think it's important to look at this, that the supplemental levy, is truly not supplemental. It is essential. And that is the way it is across the state. That, as I said last time, not only is it's about a fifth to a quarter of our budget, but as I said last time, the 93 of the 115 school districts in the state of Idaho, because of problems with funding from the legislature, have had to run supplemental levies. Last year, that totaled $194 million statewide. And so I think we need to look at that, where the problem is. The problem is that, and throughout the state, not just in Coeur d'Alene, that school districts are having to go to the local property taxpayers to fund essential services, not supplemental services. So I think we need to be clear about our wording. I think that what we're asking for, as far as the districts, as far as how the money be spent, I think is good. We're talking about security personnel, mental health staff, those kinds of things that I think that the community has said they want. The community has said they want more security. They want more mental health services. I think we're meeting that. We're also talking about giving a raise to teachers and to classified staff, and everybody knows if they take a look at their wages, we have problems there. If I'm hearing what you're saying correctly, we're also talking that if we go the $20 million route, people are still paying less, right? They'd be paying less. It doesn't say it over time. Is that right, Dr. Cook?
I don't know if I'd use the word less as much as I would use the word that the models would show essentially a flat.
Okay,
impact.
flat. So we're not talking about an increase in tax rate if we go 20 million.
That's correct.
Is that accurate? I just want to be clear.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Now, also, one more thing is, I am, as I said last time, I'm on a fixed income, and I'm very aware of property taxes. I don't have, I'm very sensitive to your concerns that have been expressed. But I also feel an obligation to support schools. Now, the big issue here to me is the permanency issue or not. That's seems to be the issue. And I came here tonight with the inclination to say we should go for the permanency because the advantage of that is some stability to our budget. That's an advantage. However, I also respect a great deal the comments and the opinions of Mr. Barlow and Ms. Quinn, and they've both been around a long time. They've very close, or been good supporters of the school district. Wanda was on the board for a long time. So I respect your judgment that the issue seems to be the permanency. That seems to be rubbing people the wrong way. And we don't want to go with the permanent levy that's going to create problems down the road for future bonds or other kinds of requests, because we obviously know we have needs for more schools beyond whatever we do in our current situation with the Prairie property and the Hayden Lake property. We just purchased 40 acres of land a while back. We have a need for another high school. We will have a need for another high school, another elementary school, another middle school. So we're going to have needs down the road. We don't want to have a situation. I thought it was interesting, your comments, Mr. Barlow, about people have long memories. I've been around here a long time too, and people do remember. And there's some things that have happened in the past that people bring up every once in a while about how money was spent. So, I'm flexible tonight. I'm interested in the opinion of the rest of the board on this issue of permanency, but I do support that because we're not raising the tax rate that we go for that we recommend a $20 million supplemental levy. And that's where I'm at. I might have further comments later, but that's where I'm at right now. Thank you.
I felt the same way coming in about the permanency, but will always remain open to discussions before I make an actual decision. And I too listened to the comments tonight, and permanency for me is, well, I looked at it as, I remember when we moved here, like, why do we have to vote for this every 2 years? I would just say, yes, we're supporters of our school district. We will always be supporters of our school district. I have kids, obviously, but regardless if my kids are grown, I just feel that it's important to maintain what we have. And we're putting out wonderful students who come back, hopefully, to our community and work or start up their own businesses, and that's important to support here in our community. But I also feel that if it was permanent or not permanent, I would still go and vote every 2 years in support. So I don't want to take that away from our voters to have the opportunity to do that. I feel like they strongly support our support is huge here in our community. That's what I love. I've always said I've loved that about our community, and I feel that even if we didn't ask for permanency, I feel like we would still have that support every 2 years, and we want to be able to give them the option to support and do that. I'm kind of leaning that way as I've written things down and thinking about it and processing it. So it's just kind of and I think that would also simplify the wording on the ballot. Yes or no. I look at some of these, and I've been reading them, and I thought, wow, I mean, it's a lot when you're reading it, and you don't want to confuse. And I just think how simple it would be if we just said yes or no, 20 million, for 2 years. Then we take away the confusion, or maybe even a split. I worry that if we yes 20 million, and some are like, yes, we want permanent, and some are no, and then some are every 2 years. What does that look like, you know, for us? So that makes me very, very nervous. And that would be another big reason of leaning towards just a simple every 2 years, 20 million ask. So my kind of 2 cents as I'm thinking out loud and processing the conversations. And thank you for being here and always giving a wonderful presentation and making it clear for me as well as anyone that's following along at home. It's pretty simple and easy to see. So thank you for being here and doing that. Anybody else?
Well, I would really like to give the voters an opportunity to have a say in whether or not it's permanent or not. But I share the same reservation as Tamara in that if we can't have a ballot that's not confusing, I worry that we just offend and don't get the right message out there, and then we're in a place where we're having to try to redo this and recoup. So despite what I had gone into the last month thinking this would be a pretty good ask, I'm hesitant with legislature and how they make us do it, and thus my hesitation on the permanency. But I do agree with the 20 million. I know I had talked a little bit about maybe looking at it higher, and do my own investigations and just reading over the stuff. I'm convinced that we need to stay right here to keep voters comfortable, that we're not asking for too much, but that we are trying to address our issues in-house with voter approval. And so there's my thoughts.
Well, I think I'll have to thank Eric. He kind of helped me with my decision tonight. I think he confirmed my concern over a levy in perpetuity, and seeing the slides and seeing back from 2000 to 2006 how we funded public education prior to the shift to sales tax. And I had the opportunity to sit down and talk to some folks over the last couple of weeks and kind of reminding historically how the community felt during those time frames, 05, 06, and they expressed that they wanted relief from property tax burden. And I feel like it's important that we listen to them. I agree that we need a $20 million levy request this year. We can't solve the problem in the next 6 months. However, I don't believe it's a permanent solution for funding public education in Idaho, and we must do better, and we must make this a commitment to go to Boise, to talk to our local legislators, and to get action, because funding education through property taxes is not a long-term solution, and it's causing more inequity in education in Idaho, and I do worry about that. I wish we could go for a levy in perpetuity. Maybe down the road that's something that we can look at. I don't believe it's a terrible idea. I like your idea of a contract or a commitment or a conversation with the community about levies being based on whatever growth we're seeing. I think that's a fair, honest conversation to have in the future. But I also think we have some work to do. We have some projects that we need to get done. We have some academic goals we want to work on. We have a new superintendent who we're thrilled to have here. And we have a strategic plan to write. So I want to see us get some work done. Get this levy passed in March, get our capital projects in order, get a capital campaign organized for the next 18 months, and look to the future. And maybe this is a conversation I feel like we can have then. But right now I'm really only comfortable with a 2-year request, especially seeing the ballot language that was possible. It makes me uncomfortable and nervous, and I think it would be a difficult day at the polls for us.
Okay. I think my thoughts are along the same wavelength as you guys, I guess. I've had trouble with permanency as one question, and I think a lot of us did, most of us, if not all of us, at the December meeting, which is why we looked at the language. Because I would just assume it'd be voter approved and not something that we're dictating. I mean, I know it's voter approved, but as a separate question. And I have concerns over the ballot language. I would not support option 1, which is permanency in one question. And I have concerns with a 2-question model. And I also have some concerns. I know we're working with the folks over at Ignite, but just That's a lot of stuff to get figured out, and I could see some confusion over that, and I just wonder if we've got the cart in front of the horse on this a little bit. So I think I support the 2-year levy option. I said last month or at our last meeting that I thought 20 million was responsible. I thought it was reasonable, and I still believe that. And I've had positive feedback on that for the most part. So I think for me, I'd be looking at option 3, which would be to put it on as a 2-year levy request. And I like what Trustee May said, that maybe we look to clean up some of this language. I know, talking with Dr. Cook, he's talked about kind of the legislative fix on that URD hiccup in the law there is what I would call it, I guess, is how the permanency is spread out. But, I'd like to see us clean some of that up if we ever decide to go for permanency.
I'd, based on the motions that Ms. Town has in the board packet, I move that the board seek voter approval for a supplemental levy in the amount of 20 million.
I'll second that.
2-year supplemental levy in the amount of 20 million.
I'll second that.
Okay. It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion on that motion?
Oh, I think we cleaned up the ballot language right here in our conversation and made it nice and simple.
Ms. May? Okay. So if there's no further discussion, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, motion carries, Ms. Town. We will see this back. This basically charts the course for the attorneys and for the district, but at our January meeting, we'll have the actual resolution with the ballot language, and that'll just need final approval. Okay.
It'll be similar to what's option 3, probably. Okay.
Okay. If there's nothing further, we will go ahead and adjourn, but there's something further.
Thank you, Chair Morserow. I was just going to mention that the language that you see for question 3 is almost what it would be, but there's a little bit that got left off of the end there. Nothing material, but it's going to look very similar to question 1. It's just going to say for 2 years. So that'll come in the resolution, but it's not identical to what's in question 3.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Okay, meeting adjourned.